The house in Goring-on-Thames stood silent on Christmas morning, 2016. Inside, in his bedroom overlooking the Thames, George Michael lay still, having slipped away peacefully in his sleep. It was a poetic and tragic end for a man whose voice had soundtracked millions of Christmases with Last Christmas, a song about heartbreak and regret that had become synonymous with the holiday season. He was 53 years old, and he died alone, a fate that seemed impossibly cruel for someone who had brought so much joy to so many people throughout his extraordinary career. But George Michael's story didn't begin in solitude. It began with a friendship that would change pop music forever, and with a young boy who used music as an escape from his insecurities. The early years, 1963 to 1981. Georgios Kyriakos Panayotou was born on the 25th of June 1963 in East Finchley, London, to Kyriakos Jack Panayotou, a Greek Cypriot restaurateur who had immigrated to England in the 1952, and Leslie Angold Harrison, an English dancer. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood before the family moved to Kingsbury and later to Radlett. As his father's business success grew, young Georgios was a complicated child, overweight, insecure about his appearance, and painfully shy. He found solace in music, spending hours in his bedroom listening to Stevie Wonder, Elton John, and Queen. Music became his refuge, his way of processing emotions he couldn't articulate. He would later describe his childhood self as lonely and desperate for acceptance, using humor and music to mask his deep insecurities. His world changed when his family moved to Bushey, and he enrolled at Bushey Mead School. There, he met Andrew Ridgeley, a confident, athletic boy with an easy charm that Georgios envied. Despite their differences, or perhaps because of them, they became inseparable friends. Andrew saw something in the shy Greek kid that others missed: a fierce intelligence, a wicked sense of humor, and an almost supernatural gift for music. They formed a ska band called The Executive, which went nowhere, but it gave Georgios his first taste of performance. He discovered that on stage, he could become someone else, someone confident, charismatic, free from the anxiety that plagued his daily life. It was intoxicating. In 1981, after The Executive disbanded, George and Andrew decided to form a duo. They would make pop music unashamedly commercial, energetic, fun. Georgios adopted the stage name George Michael, partly because it was easier to pronounce, partly because it sounded like a star's name. Wham was born. The Wham. Years: 1981 to 1986. Wham. Early days were a struggle. They couldn't get a record deal, performing at small clubs and youth centers, living on government assistance. But George was writing constantly, crafting catchy, clever pop songs that spoke to young people's experiences. Wham Rap, Enjoy What You Do, was about unemployment and choosing joy over drudgery. Young Guns warned about the trap of settling down too young. Their persistence paid off. In 1982, they signed with Innervision Records and released Young Guns, Go For It, which became a modest hit. Wham Rap followed, and then Bad Boys, which cracked the UK top 3. Their debut album Fantastic, released in July 1983, went to number 1 in the UK. George Michael, barely 20 years old, had achieved his first major success. But George was already frustrated with Innervision's contract terms and management. In a move that foreshadowed his later battles with Sony, he fought to break free from the label, claiming they were being exploited. After a legal battle, Wham signed with Epic Records, a subsidiary of CBS, and later Sony. Their second album, Make It Big, 1984, was aptly named. It was a phenomenon. Wake Me Up Before You Go Go, inspired by a note Andrew had left for his parents, was pure, distilled pop joy, impossible not to dance to, impossible not to smile at. The video with George and Andrew in Choose Life t-shirts became iconic. Careless Whisper was different, sultry, sophisticated, mature. George had started writing it at 17 on a bus ride, and it had taken years to perfect. The saxophone riff played by Steve Gregory became one of the most recognizable musical moments of the 1980 seconds. The song topped charts in 25 countries and sold over 6 million copies. It was credited to George Michael rather than Wham, a subtle but significant distinction. George was already thinking beyond the duo. Freedom later called Freedom. 84 to distinguish it from his 1990 solo track, and Everything She Wants continued their dominance. The Make It Big album sold over 10 million copies in the United States alone. They were, briefly, the biggest pop act on the planet. In 1985, Wham! Performed at Live Aid, the global charity concert organized by Bob Geldof. They represented pop music at its most exuberant, but George was already feeling constrained by Wham's image. The bright colors, the constant smiles, the projection of carefree youth, it all felt increasingly false. He was dealing with his emerging understanding of his sexuality, feeling the weight of living a lie, and yearning to create more serious, meaningful music. That same year, they became the first Western pop act to tour China, performing 2 concerts in Beijing and 1 in Canton. It was a cultural milestone, but George was already planning his exit. In 1986, Wham! Released The Edge of Heaven and announced their split. The farewell concert, the final, took place at Wembley Stadium on the 28th of June, 1986, before 72,000 fans. Elton John joined them on stage. There were tears, celebrations, and a palpable sense of the end of an era. Andrew Ridgeley understood he'd always known that George was the musical genius, and he gracefully stepped into the background. They remained close friends, their bond unbroken by the end of their professional partnership. Solo Stardom and the Faith Phenomenon, 1987 to 1990, George Michael's debut solo album, Faith, released on the 30th of October, 1987, was a masterclass in artistic reinvention. The albums cover George in a leather jacket, designer stubble, aviator sunglasses pushed up on his head, looking directly at the camera with a challenging gaze, announced a complete transformation from the boy next door Wham persona. The first single, I Want Your Sex, was deliberately provocative.
Written as a response to the AIDS crisis and promoting monogamy, it was nonetheless banned by many radio stations, and the BBC restricted it to evening airplay. The controversy only fueled interest.
The accompanying video featured George with his then-girlfriend Kathy Jung, and he wrote Explore Monogamy on her leg in lipstick. The song reached number 2 in the US and number 3 in the UK. Faith, the title track and second single, was a revelation, built around a church organ intro that sampled Wham's
Freedom, transitioning into a rockabilly guitar riff that paid homage to Elvis Presley. It was unlike anything on pop radio.
The video, featuring George in tight jeans, leather jacket, and boots, playing guitar and executing a perfect hip swivel, became an MTV staple. The song topped the Billboard Hot 100 for 4 weeks.
Father Figures showcased George's vocal range and emotional depth, a moody, sensual ballad that reached number 1 in the US. One More Try,
a powerful ballad about the fear of love after heartbreak, also topped the US charts. Monkey, a funky dance track, and Kissing a Fool, a jazz-inflected George song, demonstrated his versatility. Faith became one of the best-selling albums of all time, eventually moving over 25 million copies worldwide. It produced 6 top 5 singles in the US, topped the Billboard 200 for 12 weeks, and won the Grammy Award for Album of the Year in 1989,
making George one of the youngest solo artists to receive the honor at
age 24. The Faith World Tour ran from February 1988 to October 1989, spanning 200 performances across 4 continents. George played to stadiums and arenas, cementing his status as a global superstar. But the pressure was immense. He was being marketed as a sex symbol, appearing shirtless in concerts, driving female fans wild, when privately he was coming to terms with being gay. The dissonance was psychologically damaging. During this period, George began his secret relationship with Anselmo Felipa, a Brazilian fashion designer he met at the Rock in Rio festival in 1991. For the first time, George was in love with a man, experiencing authentic romantic connection, but he couldn't acknowledge it publicly. The strain of maintaining his heterosexual public image while living a gay private life was crushing. Artistic freedom and personal devastation. 1990 to 1998. Listen Without Prejudice, Volume 1. Released in September 1990, was George's declaration of independence from his image. He refused to appear in the music videos, except for a brief appearance at the end of Freedom 90, wanting the music to be judged on its own merits. The album's cover was a close-up black and white photograph of his face, deliberately unglamorous. Praying for Time. The lead single was a stark socially conscious meditation on inequality, greed, and social justice. With its somber piano and George's anguished vocals, it was as far from Wake Me Up Before You Go Go as possible. It reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, proving that audiences would follow him into darker territory. Freedom 90 was the album's centerpiece, a funk rock anthem about escaping the trappings of fame. The iconic video, directed by David Fincher, featured supermodels Naomi Campbell, Linda Evangelista, Christy Turlington, Cindy Crawford, and Tatiana Patic lip-syncing the lyrics while male models including Cameron Alborzian represented George. The video's climax showed symbols of George's faith, era the leather jacket, the jukebox, the guitar being destroyed. The message was clear. He was moving on. Cowboys and Angels was a deeply personal song about a relationship he couldn't publicly acknowledge. Many believe it was about Anselmo. Waiting for That Day interpolated the Rolling Stones' You Can't Always Get What You Want, while Heal the Pain and Soul Free explored themes of love and liberation. The album was critically acclaimed, selling over 8 million copies, but it wasn't the commercial juggernaut Faith had been. Sony was disappointed. They wanted another Faith, more sexy videos, more George as a pinup, more aggressive marketing. George refused. He wanted to be taken seriously as an artist, not treated as a product to be packaged and sold. The conflict escalated. George felt Sony was sabotaging the album's promotion, while Sony felt George wasn't fulfilling his promotional obligations. In October 1992, George filed a lawsuit against Sony, seeking to be released from his contract. He called the contract professional slavery, arguing that artists should have control over their work and image. The legal battle was brutal. George spent millions in legal fees, was largely unable to record new music, and endured humiliating testimony about his commercial viability. In June 1994, the UK High Court ruled against him, finding that his contract, while restrictive, was not unreasonable. George was devastated by the loss but remained defiant, refusing to record for Sony. Meanwhile, his personal life was collapsing. In 1993, Anselmo died from an AIDS-related brain hemorrhage. George was shattered. Anselmo had been his first true love, the person who had helped him accept his sexuality. But because George wasn't out, he couldn't publicly grieve. He couldn't attend the funeral without raising questions. He couldn't tell the world he'd lost the love of his life. The grief was compounded by the secrecy, the isolation, unbearable. He channeled his pain into Jesus to a Child, a hauntingly beautiful ballad released in January 1996 that paid tribute to Anselmo without explicitly revealing the nature of their relationship. The song reached #1 in the UK and became one of his most beloved tracks. Later in 1996, his mother Leslie died of cancer. George adored his mother, and her death devastated him. In the span of 3 years, he'd lost his first love and his mother, the two people who had loved him unconditionally. he fell into a deep depression, self-medicating with marijuana and retreating from public life. Through a deal brokered by David Geffen, George was eventually released from Sony and signed with DreamWorks Records in the US and Virgin Records elsewhere. In May 1996, he released Older, an album steeped in grief and melancholy. Songs like Jesus to a Child, Fast Love, Spinning the Wheel, and Star People dealt with loss, AIDS, and the search for meaning. The album was commercially successful, selling over 10 million copies. But it was clear George was struggling emotionally. On the 7th of April 1998, George's life changed forever. He was arrested in a public restroom in Will Rogers Memorial Park in Beverly Hills for engaging in a lewd act with an undercover police officer. It was a sting operation, and George was caught. The arrest was humiliating, splashed across every tabloid and news outlet worldwide. The man who had carefully guarded his sexuality for decades was outed in the most degrading way possible. But George made a remarkable choice. He refused to hide. Within weeks of the arrest, he came out publicly admitting he was gay in interviews and appearing on CNN to discuss it openly. In October 1998, he released Outside, a satirical music video that mocked the circumstances of his arrest, featuring George dancing in a public restroom surrounded by disco lights and dancing policemen. It was defiant, humorous, and liberating. The song reached number 2 in the UK, coming out freed. George in some ways, but the damage was done. Years of repression, combined with grief and substance abuse, had taken a profound toll on his mental health. Decline and struggles. 1999 to 2012. The early 2000s were marked by diminishing creative output and increasing legal troubles. Songs from the Last Century, 1999, was an album of cover songs from the 20th century standards like Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? And My Baby Just Cares for Me, showing off his vocal prowess but feeling like artistic stasis. In 2004, after 8 years without new original material, George released Patience, his first studio album since Older. Songs like Amazing, Flawless Go to the City, and John and Elvis Are Dead were strong, but George seemed disengaged from promotion. The album sold well over 5 million copies, but it lacked the cultural impact of his earlier work. His personal life was deteriorating. His relationship with Kenny Goss, a Texas businessman he'd begun dating in 1996, was strained by George's drug use and depression. He was arrested multiple times for drug possession and driving under the influence. In February 2006, he was arrested in London for possession of Class C drugs. In September 2008, he was arrested for drug possession in a public toilet in London. In August 2010, he crashed his car into a photo processing shop after using cannabis, and in September 2010, he was sentenced to 8 weeks in prison, serving 4 weeks for driving under the influence. The tabloid headlines were relentless. George Michael arrested again. Pop star's drug shame. Tragic fall of a legend. Each arrest was a public humiliation. A reminder of how far he'd fallen from his glory days. But George was dealing with demons few understood. The trauma of repressing his sexuality, the grief of losing Anselmo and his mother, the guilt of surviving the AIDS crisis that claimed so many friends. The pressure of fame it had all accumulated into a psychological weight couldn't bear. Drugs and risky behavior became ways of self-medicating, of escaping the pain, of courting oblivion. In late 2011, George contracted severe pneumonia while touring in Vienna. He was hospitalized in intensive care, his life hanging in the balance. He later revealed he'd had a tracheotomy and was unconscious for some of his 3-week hospital stay. When he emerged, gaunt and weak, he spoke about having glimpsed death. It seemed to be a wake-up call. Final act, 2012 to 2016. George's performance at the closing ceremony of the 2012 London Olympics was a triumphant return. Singing Freedom 90 in front of a global audience of billions, he reminded everyone why he'd been such an extraordinary talent. His voice, though slightly weathered, still had power and beauty. In 2014, he released Symphonica, a live album featuring orchestral arrangements of his songs and covers recorded during his 2011 to 2012 tour. It was well received, reaching #1 in the UK, but there was no new studio material. Fans wondered if he'd ever record new songs again. George spent his final years between his homes in Highgate, North London, and Goring-on-Thames, a quiet village in Oxfordshire. He was working on a documentary about his life, planning a new album, and doing occasional performances. But those close to him remained worried. He was still using drugs, still isolated, still battling depression. He gave a few revealing interviews in 2016, reflecting on his life with remarkable candor. He spoke about his sexuality, his struggles with addiction, his grief over Anselmo and his mother. He seemed at peace with who he was, proud of his music, but there was an undercurrent of sadness that never quite lifted. George was generous in ways the public rarely saw. He donated millions to charities anonymously aids research, children's hospitals, cancer charities. He worked in homeless shelters, volunteering at a soup kitchen in North London without fanfare. He quietly paid for IVF, treatments for women who couldn't afford them, funded documentaries about social issues, and supported struggling musicians. Much of this only became known after his death, revealing a depth of compassion that contradicted his tabloid image. On Christmas Eve 2016, George spent time with family and friends, seemingly in good spirits. He retired to his bedroom in Goring-on-Thames that night, putting on music perhaps his own, perhaps the soul and R&B legends he'd always loved. When his partner Fadi Fawaz found him on Christmas afternoon, George had been dead for hours, possibly since the night before. He was lying in bed peacefully, as though asleep. The coroner's report later stated he died of dilated cardiomyopathy, an enlarged heart, with myocarditis, inflammation of the heart muscle, and a fatty liver. Years of substance use had weakened his heart until it simply stopped. Legacy and loss. The news of George Michael's death on Christmas Day sent shockwaves around the world. Tributes poured in from fellow musicians, celebrities, and millions of fans. Elton John called him a brilliant talent. Madonna said, heartbroken. The world mourned the loss of one of pop music's greatest voices. George Michael sold over 120 million records worldwide, won numerous awards, and created some of the most enduring pop songs of the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds. But his legacy transcends commercial success. He was a pioneer for LGBTQ+ artists in mainstream pop music, showing that it was possible to come out and survive, even if the journey was difficult. His philanthropy was extraordinary. After his death, stories emerged of his quiet generosity, the waitress whose IVF treatment he paid for after overhearing her conversation, the woman whose debt he cleared on a game show, the countless donations to AIDS charities in memory of Anselmo. His music endures. Careless Whisper remains one of the most played songs on radio. Faith is a karaoke staple and cultural touchstone. Freedom 90 is in 90, anthem of artistic liberation. And Last Christmas, the Wham, song that became bigger than almost anything else he recorded, plays every year in malls and on radio stations, a bittersweet reminder of a man who gave us so much joy while battling so much pain. George Michael died alone on Christmas morning in 2016, but his voice, that extraordinary, soulful, powerful voice, continues to reach millions, in death as in life. He remains a superstar, forever frozen in time at his peak, forever talented, forever complicated, forever missed. The final tragedy is that George Michael spent so much of his life feeling alone, misunderstood, and trapped by his fame. Yet through his music, he connected with hundreds of millions of people, touching their lives, soundtracking their moments of joy and heartbreak. He was loved more than he ever realized, appreciated more than he could accept. On Christmas Day, When families gather and Last Christmas inevitably plays, there's a moment of recognition, a remembrance of the man who sang about giving his heart away and died on the very holiday his most famous song celebrates. It's poignant, tragic, and somehow perfect. George Michael's life was a beautiful, heartbreaking song, one that ended too soon, but one that will play forever